Welcome everyone to our session today, the true cost of storage on premises versus cloud, accelerating digital transformation with operational simplicity. I'm Terica Hutchinson, your moderator for this session. Today's session will be recorded for your viewing later. Our goal is to make this interactive and engaging, so please ask your questions and engage with our presenters. We do ask that you use the Q&A box and
Welcome
not chat.
Everyone to our session today.
Also, our product teams would love to hear from each of you.
Versus cloud, accelerating digital transformation.
So without further ado, let's go ahead and get this session started, and we're going to turn it over to Anna Simpson and Rich Rose.
Thanks for the intro. My name is Anna Simpson. I am Director of Product Management for Data Protection Management and Insights. And today I'm here to talk to you about the true cost of storage. So really this is about accelerating digital transformation with operational simplicity. So 2020 was certainly an interesting year, to say the least. We saw a lot of different trends, and particularly trends around digital transformation. A few things that I wanted to highlight were really around cloud adoption. The first being that by the year 2022, it's anticipated that 50% of business critical applications will actually reside in the cloud. And this aligns with the accelerated digital transformation that we've seen in 2020. The second trend is around multi-cloud strategy. So 93% of enterprises actually already have a multi-cloud strategy. And right now, public cloud is actually the preferred method. This is useful for multi-cloud essentially because it reduces the risk that can be associated with vendor lock-in. And then the third trend is really around reduced investment. And here we're talking about IT spend. So depending on the analyst that you look at, it's between 5 and 8% reduction in 2020. And again, that aligns with revenues dropping for almost all enterprises. So 2020 was really about doing more with less. So when we think about cost optimization, it really was an accelerator for digital transformation. And the whole idea with this journey is we want to get to operational simplicity. So with that acceleration, the challenge becomes, as we make decisions, can we actually backtrack from them if we need to? So can we essentially hit the rewind button? This is actually a good opportunity to stop and pause and actually evaluate. So understand what you have. So what applications and data that you're storing, what's the real cost of storing them where they are? And could you actually just optimize in place? Does actually migrating them even make financial sense? But regardless, we know that some data and applications will actually move to the cloud. And when they do, it's important to have a strategy to understand and identify opportunities for efficiencies moving forward, and obviously continue to reduce costs, because that end goal really is operational simplicity. So we talked about public cloud a little bit. It's important to understand that not all storage is created equal. And this is particularly important when we are talking about public cloud. When we look at different vendors, there's a few things that you should consider. The first is around the actual available features of what they offer. So that could be things like data protection or security, and also the level of control that you will have within those environments. We also need to take into account the resources which are required, because those resources are actually allocated to virtual instances. So you have to consider things like compute, storage, networking, as well as hours on demand. So essentially when an application is going to be active. And finally, perhaps the most important part is we need to understand pricing. And part of that is certainly discounting. So there'll be a dollar amount associated, but depending on your investment and commitment to that public cloud vendor, that will determine the discount that you get. So to make this even a little bit more complex, if we're going from on-premise to public cloud, you have to do some translation. So if we look at the examples that we have here, you'll see I have two virtual machines, which are highlighted, which have different CPU and RAM combinations. And then next to that, you'll see they're equivalent from a virtual perspective in various public clouds. So you'll see we have them mapped for Azure and AWS. Making these mappings can be complex because it's kind of a manual process. So at a basic level, you essentially have to, first of all, identify which VMs are essentially part of a particular application or storing certain data. And then you also have to understand the allocated resources for those. So that would be compute, memory, and the disk space, which has been allocated to them. And then, as you can see, you can go through and map relative to the public cloud vendor of your choice. But again, it's a manual process. A different way of approaching this is an insight-led multi-cloud strategy. So if we think about the basic things that we highlighted, so the actual resource allocation, so CPU, RAM, disk, what if we take that to the next level? So what if we actually look at the usage of those resources, how they're being used on-prem, so we can make the translation to how they're going to be used in the cloud. And then we can take into consideration some other things as well. So the actual uptime of the application. So again, that sort of translates to those on-demand hours. And then some other considerations are things like location, because that could have other impacts, such as data sovereignty. And then obviously, cost is really important. So being able to do a comparison between different vendors to make sure that you are optimizing and finding efficiencies wherever possible. So this is where Aptar comes into play. So Aptar visualize storage and data protection agnostically. So that means any storage, any cloud, and any backup. What we're able to do is automatically correlate and aggregate thousands of data points. And then we can also ingest data from third parties. So a really good example of this is information from public cloud vendors, things like the resources that they require for their virtual instances, as well as the actual costs associated to them. And then the way that we consume that information is through reports, as well as configurable dashboards. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. So let's intelligently migrate to the cloud. This is actually a report from Aptar. And here I'm going to highlight the first VM instance. So this is essentially showing what exists on premise and then giving a translation to what it could look like if we were to migrate that data to Azure. The first thing that I want to point out is that we're actually able to identify not only the allocated resources, so CPU and RAM, but we can also get visibility into the actual usage. So in terms of what's being used versus allocated, you'll see here that it's fairly insignificant. So we've over-provisioned resources in this instance. What we can do within Aptar is we can make the translation relative to the allocated resources. So you'll see there it has a D5 V2 to correlate with those allocated resources, but we also give you a recommended type. So essentially, if you were to optimize your resources, you could go down to a sort of lower tier Azure instance. And what this translates to by right sizing is considerable cost savings. So you'll see in this instance that we are actually able to save 87.5%. So huge savings just by applying intelligence to this particular scenario. So we've gone to the cloud. Now let's look at being in the cloud. So Aptar gives visibility into cost so that you can plan for the future. You'll see here that we have trends. This is actually a cloud spend dashboard, which essentially aggregates information from multiple different public clouds. So here you can see that you can monitor your spend over time, so that trending. We also give you visibility into the actual instance types which are being leveraged. And this can be useful as you go into negotiations when a contract comes up to renewal, because you have visibility into what you're using and how you're actually using it. And finally, you can also create accountability. We can actually track the location of these instances as well. So again, this can tie into that data sovereignty use case I mentioned, but it can also tie into, as I said, creating accountability. So tying data or applications back to specific owners or business units. So essentially, Aptar is really designed to help drive a multi-cloud strategy. And it's doing it with insights, it's doing it with intelligence. And with any multi-cloud strategy, it's going to be a multi-phase approach. You're going to continue to iterate through these different processes. You need to have insights to understand what you have on premise, as well as what you have with your different cloud vendor providers. And once you have those insights, you can apply intelligence and make decisions. And those decisions could be around resource optimization. They could also be around data migration. But the key here is that we can continue to monitor our costs and adjust as needed. And in this process, we continue to identify efficiencies for operational simplicity. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rich Rose, Dr. Aptar, to actually walk you through this in real time.
Thanks, Anna. So for those of you that are not familiar with Aptar, Aptar has always been the tool of choice for customers to go to see their entire environment in a single pane of glass. And today what we're going to talk about is how we're using some of that information to help customers guide them through their cloud migration. Most of the customers I'm working with now have had some kind of mandate that they have to migrate 30% of their on-prem environment to the cloud by a certain time frame. And anybody that's ever tried to do that, they have a hard enough time figuring out what their current on-prem environment is doing, let alone how to figure out and prioritize which VMs to move, and then how effectively to move them. And so what I'm showing you here is we've always been able to gather statistics about an on-prem VMware environment. You can see that I've got hosts here, and I can see how much memory they've used over a period of time, and I can see how much CPU that they've used over that same period of time. These are just reports that customers have always been accustomed to getting using Aptar. As we start looking at this cloud move, we start thinking about now, all right, if I were to take these hosts as I have them configured right now, and if I were to move them to the cloud, well, what would that translate to, and then how much would that actually cost us? So we've been working with several of our customers that are going through this cloud migration right now to look at their existing on-prem environment, analyze it, and then help them right-size what it would be if they were to do that migration. So as an example, you can see I've got a VM guest here called Service Lab 7. It's got 16 vCPUs configured, and it's got 16 gigabytes of RAM. It's a typical configuration. Now, if you were to take that host and move it to AWS with 16 gigs of RAM and 16 CPUs, that would translate to what AWS would say is an M4 4 extra large. Now, Aptar is also calculating how many hours that VM has been running. So we can see it's been running for 682 hours. And so at 682 hours times the rate that AWS would charge for that instance type, that particular system would cost $545 a month if I just took, as it's configured right now, lifted and shifted it and moved it into the cloud. Now, because of the screen that I showed you earlier, you could see that we are metering the actual CPU usage and the actual memory usage. And the peak memory that system actually used was only 3.42% of the 16 vCPUs that were configured. And in terms of memory, it's only used 27% of that 16 gigabytes of memory. So rather than needing to be an M4 4 extra large, because of its actual usage, it would translate to an M4 large, which in this case would only cost $68 a month, which is a savings of $477 per month. You can see now that that is a significant savings, especially when we're talking about a lot of my customers. We're talking thousands of VMs that are potentially moving to the cloud. And you can see at the bottom line here as the totals, it's a significant savings. If you just took it as it was configured in this small environment that I have here, that would cost about $8,000 a month as it's configured. However, if we right-sized it using Aptar, we'll see that we're only spending $1,000 a month. It's a $6,000 savings roughly. We can do that same thing with Azure. So that same system with the 16 gigs of RAM, 16 CPUs, or its current usage would translate in Azure to a D5 V2. However, Aptar determined it's not using that much, so it actually need to be what Azure would call a D2 V2 instance type, which again would be significantly less money. And because of Aptar's ability to be able to create these dashboards, you can actually have these side-by-side comparisons of AWS versus Azure. And a lot of our customers are actually kind of hitting the pause button on the cloud migration as they are now starting to look at this stuff and right-size it. And some of them are determining that certain workloads are actually better to keep on-prem than to actually move to the cloud. Now, once you get there, Aptar is still there for you, because as you start moving these workloads to the cloud, you now have a single pane of glass where you can look across your AWS instances, you can look at your Azure instances, and you can look at your on-prem instances all in the same place. We're gathering all the billing records from Azure and AWS, so you'll be able to monitor your cloud costs, and we can assign costs on your on-prem environment and allow you to be able to see how your on-prem costs are comparing against your cloud costs. So Aptar is the tool that you will use to help and guide you through this entire cloud migration, saving you storage, saving you on CPU, saving you on memory, and most of all, saving you on money. Thank you.
Thank you, team. And as I mentioned earlier, at Veritas, we love to hear your feedback. So let's take a look at a couple polling questions, and we'd love to hear from you. So our first question is, how much of your infrastructure resides in the public cloud today? And we'll give you a few minutes to go ahead and get your answers in, either 0%, 25%, 50%, 75%, or 100. All right, we're getting a lot of responses here.
The only on-prem I have is my laptop, so all the rest is in the cloud. But I don't have a very big enterprise.
All right, so let's give it about 30 more seconds and let's see what the results are for this question.
Looks like a lot of 25%.
All right, and is that what we see, Richie, you see that to be very common, or what are some of your thoughts on the results here?
Yeah, I see that that's about where I'm seeing it right now. I think a lot of the customers started moving some of their applications first. So a lot of the Office 365 stuff was their initial toe into it. And I know at least us from a development standpoint, you know, we had a lot of our developers had multiple instances in a cloud. So that I think even within organizations, that was their first foray too, is in their kind of test and UAT environments, is to start doing that. But I'm seeing a lot more production workloads moving to the cloud.
Nice. So it looks like most of our audience is pretty on par with the 25%. So one more question here for our poll that we will go ahead and kick off. And that is, how much of your infrastructure do you plan to migrate to the public cloud in the next few months, in the next 12 months, to be very specific here? Same answers: 0, 25, 50, 75, or 100.
I guess while we're waiting for the results to come in, Rich, have you actually seen sort of an acceleration with customers to that cloud adoption in the last 12 months?
Yes, I have. I'm not entirely sure what the motivation is. A lot of, there seems to be at least this perception that there should be some, if not a large percentage, in the cloud. And I know that a lot of my customers have been mandated, and saying in the next so many months, you've got to have a third of these resources in a cloud. And so now they're like scrambling around trying to figure out what that third should be. So there's a lot of factors that are motivating it. And I've got other customers that have done, extensive analysis, and they've determined that a lot of their workloads, if not all of them, it's cheaper for them to, there's no cloud provider that can do it for less money than they're doing on-prem. So I'm seeing really both scenarios. But even of the ones that are keeping a lot of the workloads in the cloud, they still have a lot of cloud native applications that they're using, like ServiceNow and others.
Makes a lot of sense.
So it looks like we're back at 25% again as well for this one, with about 15 responses. And we have a couple at 0 and 50% as well. 50% seems to be increasing a little bit here, but 56% so far at the 25% is how much of their infrastructure they plan to migrate to the cloud in the next 12 months.
And Rich, I guess you spoke a lot about right sizing. Well, we both did actually, I guess. Is that something that you see customers don't realize? They kind of are just going through this lift and shift process rather than doing that sort of due diligence upfront?
Yeah, a lot of times it's hard to, the stuff that we made very simple in our Aptar reports are really quite complicated. Especially, you can imagine we've got mostly enterprise-sized customers here at Veritas. So I've got, customers that have 40, 50,000 VMs in their environment. And it's without a tool like Aptar, it's really hard to take a look at 50,000 VMs and figure out, which ones are which. And the other thing is that VMware can handle the over provisioning. So if it's very common to set up systems with, 32 gigs of RAM and 16 CPUs, and VMware will just load balance and do whatever it needs to do, and it's fine. And it doesn't charge you. However, when you move those workloads to the cloud, if you've got 32 vCPUs and 64 gigs of RAM, they're going to charge you for that, whether you're actually using them or not. So that's kind of the difference. That when you got an on-prem environment, you've got a lot more flexibility. When you go to the cloud, you're paying for what you're paying for, the thing, whether you're actually using it or not. So that's really where we come in and give you an understanding of what you're actually using and figuring out the right size that would be. And then a lot of times that spawns two things. So one is they will go like, wow, why are we doing this? And two, we don't really have to buy more hardware because we have a lot more available capacity than we thought we did. And then also the awareness of what that would cost if they were to move it to the cloud is kind of shocking.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess that really becomes a pain point, right? Once you start seeing those bills, right? To your point, you're not seeing it if VMware is allowing that provisioning. So
yeah, and then there's a lot of other things that we can measure and help measure that, it's beyond just CPU and memory. It's, there's the disk IO, and there's also a lot of ingress and egress charges. So you don't know that host might have data that's being replicated to another data center. Well, in the cloud, that would be going to a different availability zone potentially. And again, there's more cost that's incurred with that. So we really have to analyze a lot of stuff on-prem. Otherwise, it is a big surprise when those workloads move and they get that first bill.
So we do have a question. Q&A is still open, so feel free to ask any questions to Anna and Rich. One question we do have is, if we right size a server to the cloud, does that impact servers or apps that look for a certain amount of RAM? Or is that purely virtual or cloud provider?
It's a good question. I know that a lot of applications require you to pre-allocate a certain amount of capacity. And really they will use it as a prereq, that they won't even go and do the installation unless you have X amount of memory and X amount of CPU. So we have to weigh that, obviously. And I do have a lot of customers that have certain applications. Epic is one of them, with a lot of our healthcare providers that require you have these systems that are X size, whether you actually need them or not. And so that's kind of an edge case. But I think for the by and large, a lot of the types of applications that people have on-prem are ones that have that kind of flexibility, that they can, truly right size them or even consolidate them for that matter. So, and we can, again, provide that kind of visibility.
Thank you. And don't forget, we do have 5 more minutes if there are any other questions. In the meantime, Rich or Anna, are there any other final words that you might want to provide to the audience today as they prepare for their cloud journey?
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, when we look at Aptar, the real differentiation there is that it is sort of aggregating and correlating all of these different data points. So it can sort of give you that full enterprise view, as well as overlaying it with sort of that third-party data. So things like pricing, as an example, which you saw both in my slides and then also in Richard's demo. So there's certainly a lot of power there, and it's just bubbling up that value to the top.
Yeah, and I'd like to say too, it's also integrating it with your existing business assets. There's a lot of tools out there, you know, there's Grafana and Graphite and Prometheus that can gather these statistics and display stuff in dashboards and stuff, but they really don't do any kind of correlation. And that's another thing that is very important, is that knowing not only consumption, but also what consumption is being consumed by application or by business unit or by, you know, the other parts of it, the real business related aspects of that IT infrastructure. So it's not just having, you know, workloads out there and then just getting a bill, and then, you know, it's really then trying to figure out what the actual business impact is.
Right. So we do have a couple questions that are coming in here. So one question, are we able to see the disk IO per VM with Aptar?
Yes. Didn't show that one on the slide. I should have. It's not as exciting as the memory, because they're kind of like, they tend to be a little bit flatter, but absolutely that's part of it. And I didn't really include that in the calculation in that on those particular examples, but absolutely we know. In fact, we have a report library that you can visit, reportlibrary.veritas.com. And there's some examples of reports that show the disk IO statistics, and they also show like your problem children. So the ones that have top 10 that have the most CPU use, top 10 that have the most disk IO, the top 10 that have the most memory consumption, and then it'll rank them. And so you might have VMs that will rank in several of those top 10 categories, and those are your real problem children. But yes, we do absolutely gather that.
And then another question on storage capacity. What type of insights does Aptar Analytics provide to customers planning cloud migration?
Well, again, we know everything about your environment. So we're going to get from the VM all the way down through the spindle. And so we'll know each guest, we'll know the data storage using, we'll know the actual storage array that it's attached to, and we'll know what LUN it's actually using. And then from there, we're going to know all of the IO statistics from the VM's perspective. We're going to know the tier of storage, because we're going to know what type of array it's attached to. We're also going to know if that storage might be replicated to another data center. So a lot of customers are using replication technologies, and that's going to give you additional insight as to what you might need when you're doing the cloud migration. There's a lot to it. It's a lot of data to analyze, and I think that's really what Aptar brings to the table, is we can analyze thousands of VMs and be able to show you what their disk usage is, what their CPU memory, and all the other stuff. And the other thing is protection. I didn't even mention that, but you know, once you move it to the cloud, they're not necessarily backed up. In fact, you know, they're not. And so the other part of it is also knowing, once you start having this hybrid environment of on-prem and VM, to know whether they're actually being protected or not. When was their last backup? You know, are they, do they have the same regulatory compliance? Do I have a backup that's got maybe a 5-year retention period on it because of a compliance regulation? So we still handle all of that, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud.
Okay. Then we have network devices have been out of the scope for Aptar IT Analytics, as also enterprise moves to NAS. I see a need for network visibility. Has this been missed, or is this on the roadmap for any time in the future?
Yeah, we've been avoiding the whole network thing because there's so many other network management tools out there. But we do now, I mean, in terms of NAS, we've always had support for the IO going across from a NAS perspective, and the same thing for iSCSI. We're just not going outside the data path with those statistics. So for NAS, we will show you what your packet usage is, and also at the host level, we can show you network packet usage. What we won't do right now is just collect from a switch and show you the giant spaghetti map of, you know, what all the stuff is connected. We will from the SAN perspective, but not for IP.
Okay. Does Aptar
We might change our mind though. Because obviously as workloads are in the cloud, network is your gateway there. And so I'm not totally dismissing that. And as the product manager, so why don't you put a little pin in that one and maybe we'll revisit it.
And then we have, does Aptar show the disk space used inside a thick VMDK?
Yes, we do. We show it from the VMDK perspective, and if that VMDK or data store is mapped to a storage array, and maybe it's part of a pool, and that pool might be oversubscribed, we're going to even show you from the array perspective how much is actually used by that, and also potentially other systems that might be sharing that same pool that could be putting it at risk or slowing it down.
Okay. Are we able to see storage raw devices per VMs and also guest OS visibility of the file systems?
Yes, and yes. So you'll be able to see from a file system perspective, if it's Windows, we're going to show your NTFS. If it's Linux, we're going to show your whatever file system might be on there, including Veritas file system. And we'll show by OS, which is another important factor too, because you're going to, different virtual machines will cost more if they have Windows on them than a Linux one because of the OS cost. And what was the other part of that? Anyway, I think I covered them.
Yes. And then we have the last two questions. Can reports be scheduled to be emailed?
Oh, that's an easy question. That's a loaded one. Of course they can. Well, within Aptar they can. Yeah, Aptar's got a built-in scheduler that will schedule the distribution of reports, dashboards. It'll schedule the collection intervals and everything else. So yeah, if it can be fully automated, fully hands-off. One other thing is that there is a REST API as well that a lot of our customers are using for automation. So Aptar can kind of prefetch that data for you. You can make a REST call into Aptar and then feed some automation or auto provisioning or whatever type of automation that you're trying to achieve with the statistics that are provided by Aptar.
Okay. And last question, may we consume Aptar reports using APIs?
I answered it, but yes. So every report in Aptar, once saved, has its own unique identifier. You can do a key sequence, Control-Alt-T. It'll tell you that a report ID, and then you can make a REST call referencing that ID, and it'll come back to your, that API REST call will come back to you in JSON format or whatever format you specify. Most of the automation tools call our REST API and return to JSON format. However, depending on the type of report, some things don't look good in JSON format.
All right, so as we have reached the end of our time for this session, I'd like to thank all of you in attendance for spending time with the Veritas team today. I'd also like to thank our speakers, Anna and Rich, for leading us in a discussion on understanding the true cost of storage. If you have any further questions on this topic, please reach out to your Veritas representative, or you can schedule some time to gain more insights. Otherwise, we hope you enjoy the remainder of our Conquer Every Cloud event today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.